The cell membrane is a structure that is found in all organisms, whether it is animals, plants, or bacteria. They all have a cell membrane. So it's found in both prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Now, but what is a cell membrane? So a cell membrane is a structure that encompasses a cell. So if we imagine a cell and its intracellular components, the intracellular components are outlined by a layer, and that layer is referred to as the cell membrane. So essentially, the cell membrane functions to control what goes in and out of the cell. So another word to describe the cell membrane is semi-permeable. So the cell membrane is semi-permeable. It means that it is permeable. It only allows the passage of certain molecules. It does not allow the passage of all molecules. And that is very important because let's say, for example, let's consider a human cell. We don't want any molecule coming in and we don't want any molecule going out. So that is why our cell membrane is semi-permeable and it controls what goes in and out. Now, this over here is a zoomed in depiction of a cell membrane. Now, the most common structure that you see over here in the cell membrane is this blue and beige structure. Now, what is this called? That structure is called a phospholipid. Now, a phospholipid is made up of a phosphate head and a fatty acid tail. Now, the phosphate head is polar, and the fatty acid tail is nonpolar. What do polar and nonpolar mean? Another word for polar is hydrophilic, and another word for nonpolar is hydrophobic. Polar or hydrophilic means you are water-loving. Nonpolar and hydrophobic means you are not water-loving. So the fatty acid tail of a phospholipid is nonpolar, whereas the phosphate head of a phospholipid is polar. Now, once again, a phospholipid is a structure, and the two components that make up a phospholipid are the phosphate head and the fatty acid tail. So the phospholipid essentially has components that are both polar and nonpolar, because the phosphate head is polar, fatty acid tail is nonpolar. Since the phospholipid has both polar and nonpolar regions, overall it is referred to as amphipathic. Amphipathic means that the structure is both polar and nonpolar. So the phospholipid is amphipathic, so it is polar and nonpolar. That is very important because the amphipathic nature of the phospholipid governs the structure of the cell membrane. Now, what does that mean? If we take a look at the cell membrane, we can see that the fatty acids are all facing each other, whereas the phosphate heads are facing away. So the phosphate head on this side is facing the exterior of the cell, and the phosphate head over here is facing the interior of the cell. Why is that? The exterior and the interior sides of the cell are an aqueous environment, which is polar. So since the interior is polar and the exterior is polar, the phosphate head is going to face the polar side. Why is that? It's because polar molecules want to be with other polar molecules, and nonpolar molecules want to be with other nonpolar molecules. We can think of an analogy in everyday life. Let's think about water and oil. If we took a glass and filled it up with water and oil, they would not mix together very well. We would get two very distinct layers of water, and we would get a distinct layer of oil. Now, they will not mix. It's because oil is nonpolar. It is hydrophobic. It is not water-loving. It does not want to mix into the water. Whereas water is polar, it is hydrophilic, it is water-loving. So the polar water molecules will stay together and the non-polar oil molecules will stay together, and the two will not mix in with each other. That is exactly what we see in a cell membrane. We see that the polar phosphate heads will face the interior and the exterior because the interior and exterior are polar. And we will see the fatty acid tails face each other to form a hydrophobic nonpolar region. So that is the arrangement of the phospholipids in the plasma membrane. But in the plasma membrane, we also have other structures. And we'll start over here with this large structure, which is an integral protein. Integral proteins, so this one can be referred to as a transmembrane protein because it spans all the way through the membrane. The integral protein is responsible for transporting molecules in and out. We can have proteins that are symporters, which means that they transport two things together in the same direction. We can have antiporters, which will transport things in the opposite direction. Or we can have uniporters, which will transport one thing at a time. And directionality will also matter, whether this transporter will bring things in or whether it will bring things out, or it can do both. So when a protein goes through the plasma membrane, we call it an integral protein because it integrates through the cell membrane. But when our protein does not go all the way through, it's on the periphery, we refer to it as a peripheral protein. So these are all peripheral proteins. Now, peripheral proteins are also involved in transporting molecules, but they are also involved in signaling reactions. For example, we can have this protein over here, which is a specific type of protein called a glycoprotein. So a glycoprotein is made up of a protein and sugar. Now, glycoproteins function in cell-to-cell recognition. So we can have integral proteins, we can have peripheral proteins, we can have glycoproteins, and then we can also have cholesterol. Now, cholesterol is very important because it helps maintain cell fluidity. Now, a cell membrane, we don't want it to be too fluid and we don't want it to be too rigid. We want the fluidity to be just right, because if our cell membrane is too rigid, if our phosphates are too compact, it's not going to allow the passage of molecules. And if we are too fluid, meaning these phosphate heads are further apart from one another, we may allow molecules that shouldn't be going in or shouldn't be going out. So we want to maintain the fluidity to be just right. And cholesterol helps with maintaining our cell membrane fluidity. Now, speaking about what goes in and what goes out, let's talk about what can go in and out, starting with our small molecules. So if a molecule is small and nonpolar, it will be able to pass through the cell membrane and it will not need a transporter of any sort. So if you are small and nonpolar, you can pass through. So let's think of a small nonpolar molecule, oxygen. Oxygen is small and it is nonpolar, so it will be able to pass through. Now let's talk about small and polar. What is small and polar? H2O. H2O is small and polar. Water can pass through the cell membrane, but it's going to have a slightly more difficult time compared to a small nonpolar molecule, because this region over here, it's all nonpolar. And remember, nonpolar wants to be with nonpolar. So a small nonpolar molecule, it's not going to have a hard time passing through because this is all nonpolar. A small nonpolar molecule is nonpolar, so it will not have a hard time. But if you're small and polar, you're going to have a little bit of a difficult time because you're in a nonpolar region. Now, let's talk about our large molecules. We've talked about small polar and small nonpolar. Let's talk about large and polar and large and nonpolar. Large nonpolar molecules like steroids, testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, these are all nonpolar molecules and they will be able to still pass through the cell membrane, but they are going to have a difficult time because they are large. So large nonpolar molecules, they can still pass through, but they're going to have a hard time. But large polar molecules, large and polar, they will not be able to pass through the cell membrane. They will require a transporter of some sort to pass through. And that is essentially the fluid mosaic model. The fluid mosaic model describes the structure of our cell membrane, the components of our cell membrane. And remember, this plasma membrane, it's present in all organisms. It's going to be in humans, it's going to be in other animals, it's going to be found in plants, and it's going to be found in bacteria. And we have some key components. We have our integral proteins, our peripheral proteins, our glycoproteins, which function in cell-to-cell recognition. Our peripheral proteins will function in cell signaling, and we have cholesterol, which will maintain our fluidity. And most importantly, remember that a phospholipid is amphipathic. It is polar and it is non-polar. The nonpolar component is the fatty acid tail, and the polar component is the phosphate head. And together, the phosphate head and the fatty acid make up our phospholipid.